What up, Wackety Racing Channel? Welcome back. It's going to be a fairly short video this week. We're going to be continuing with Project Hidalgo and installing some of those interior parts that I've accumulated. One of which that I'm most excited about is the headliner. I was able to find a headliner that I think I can make work, and I already have a plan for that, as well as being able to swap out the back glass for a single piece back window instead of the 4-piece slider. So stay tuned, I'll show you what it's all about. I think the first thing I'm going to try and work on is getting the headliner in. Mostly just because it's such a big piece of real estate that doing something with it is going to make it look like I got a lot done in a very short amount of time, as well as the fact that it's going to make it easier to work on everything else, knowing that that is already up and out of the way and I don't have to pull it back down. Then I can start working on everything else below that, like the dash, the carpet, and the seats and things of that nature. So let's get started. So here's our headliner. Now, this truck never had one, and I don't know what trim models would have had one, but I imagine finding someone to ship one of these, if I could find it, would be difficult, and not from a lack of looking. I tried for a while to find one, and ultimately found this out of an '87 Suburban. And ironically, even though it's the same blue, it was not the same Suburban I got the doors from. Now, the length on the Suburban is a little bit different. So you can see that we had to graft the rear of the Suburban one to the end of the front section of the Suburban to make up the distance, but now it does fit our cab. So that'll work nicely. But I want to go ahead and get this thing covered up. That was the plan from the get-go, so let's show you what I'm doing. Now, one of the things that I knew as soon as I decided that this truck was getting a headliner was I wanted an American flag for headliner. Now, the problem with that is the color and contrast that I'm using is going to make that look really clashy. So I wanted to actually vintage this flag so that the color contrast worked. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to antique or vintage this American flag. Now, obviously, we're not going to do that with a brand new flag, so I got this one with a stain on eBay for a really good price, considering it's high quality and fully woven cotton. Now, it's a nice piece, but it was stained. So I'm going to be able to use it for what we're going to do with it. I'm going to explain why that's okay for those with concerns here in a little bit. But for now, let's show you the process. So we're going to be using two techniques to vintage this flag. Now, being as this flag already had a stain on it, and we know that it's not going to come out, we're going to be using that to our advantage. So we've used coffee in splotches to try and add some depth and texture so that it's not all one uniform color. Secondarily, we're going to be soaking it in tea and tea bags to try and take this off-white color and make it more of a parchment paper color that matches with our contrast a little bit more. And more importantly, when it's in its headliner position, it's easier to maintain. That way, we're not getting the flag dirty, and it's easier to look clean all the time if it's already started from a vintage perspective, as opposed to getting dirty later. That way, this thing always looks the way that was intended to match the truck, and it's never being tarnished or disrespected. We have this giant pot here, and we've introduced about a dozen tea bags and brought it to a low boil, then brought it down to a simmer. Then we introduced our flag. Now, it's been in here for about 15 minutes, and it's starting to catch some coloration. We're going to leave it a little bit longer, let it settle, and then once it starts to cool down, we'll go ahead and rinse some of the coloration out of it. And it should be a nice off-white parchment color, which is what we're looking for to match the interior of the truck. But it's starting to take a little bit of color. As you can see, it's starting to yellow out a little bit, which is what we're looking for. So hopefully it'll take on a little bit more by the time it's done cooling. So this thing should look something like this. There it is. So there's our headliner. So it's not perfect. There's a couple of little wrinkles and there are a few stains on this flag, but I'm pretty happy with that. So the big thing is I have to wire all the cab lights, which I put off last time. So we got to extend the leads on those, wire them all together and run them off to the side before we can put the headliner in. So we're going to work on that the rest of the night, and as soon as we can get those all wired, we'll go ahead and get this bad boy installed. Okay, so I ran an iron across this morning, and it looks pretty good. It's not perfect, but I don't think perfect was ever really an option. There's a lot of wrinkles to try and fight and a lot of movement in the material, especially because the headliner itself flexes. So we'll have to see what happens when we actually get it installed. However, our cab lights, Daniel stuck around last night and helped me get all the wires dropped through for the cab lights. So I can go ahead and get those all stuck together, run them down the A-pillar. Then when I install the headliner, I don't have to worry about how I get access to those wires later. I can just move forward and I shouldn't have to pull that down for anything. Well, I got my cab lights all run to a common ground, and they come down there, and we can go ahead and hook those up later. I had to pull out the original wiring, and the previous owner had clearly just twisted everything together and electrical taped it. So this was a fire hazard. I'm really glad that we pulled all this out. So I'm gonna get rid of that. Now it's time to try and get the headliner in. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to pop out the back window so that it can move in straight across the cab so you don't have to fold it up. I also happen to have a single piece back glass because I hate the 4-piece back glass. So I think we're going to try and get that window out. So in the mid 70s and up into the early 80s, it was actually fairly uncommon to have air conditioning as an option. So a lot of generational trucks like this into the late 60s to the early 80s, you'd see this 4-piece back glass pretty prominently because it was easier to just open the back window and have airflow that way than a lot of times paying for the additional air conditioning cost. So this truck was never outfitted, so I'm assuming that they had this in here to try and get some airflow to the truck. It's really common. Unfortunately, I don't like the look of it, and it doesn't have any purpose for what I'm doing. So I got a single piece glass for this and a new gasket. So I'm gonna go ahead and try and get this glass out, hopefully not damaging it in case someone else can use it, and put the new glass in. But while we have the rear glass out, that's the easiest time to slide in the new headliner so we don't have to fold it up to get it in there. So now with the gasket most of the way cut out, I should be able to pull this thing out. Hopefully there's not a whole lot of rust behind it. So after getting the old window out, as well as the old gasket, we do have some mild rust concerns that need to be evaluated before we can move forward. Now, it's nothing like the carnage that was underneath the underside of the truck. It's much more mild than that. Obviously, some dust has settled in the pinch weld where the two pieces of body come together, and it's made a little bit of surface rust. So I want to clean that up with a wire wheel and spray everything down with some rust inhibitor before we move forward. That way I'm not accidentally painting anything else in the interior while I do that, and I know what I'm dealing with before installing the new gasket, which hopefully is going to go right over that. We'll never have to deal with much more of it. But I don't think I'm going to have to do any sheet metal patching. Should just be cleanup. But I got to do that before I can do the fun stuff. Now this part might prove difficult to film because it's going to be kind of a two-person thing in a confined space, but I'll show you guys afterwards what it all looks like. So we're going to be passing the headliner through the back, putting it in place, and I've been slowly accumulating all of the trim that covers the interior, like the risers and up and over there, and you can actually see I've actually got the C-pillar cover already in place, and the ones that go in the back, like so. So I've been accumulating all this interior stuff, and it should be able to hold up the headliner. Now some of it's kind of hodgepodge together because I had a really difficult time finding the appropriate parts specifically for a crew cab and not either a Suburban, a Blazer, or a single cab. So it won't be perfect, but I've already kind of gotten the trim mocked into place, and I feel confident that it's going to look a lot better than it does right now. So let's try and get the headliner in. So the headliner is in the truck, but with how close everything sits next to the actual seal for the rear glass, I think it's going to be best to throw the rear glass in before installing that. That way we don't have to do it both twice, because it's going to be really hard to get that thing to seal if I'm fighting a headliner that's going to be right in the way. So I think we're going to try and get the glass in now. Hopefully that goes pretty well. All right, it only took about an hour and a half, and we only had one blood contribution to get the window in, which is probably what got it in. But ultimately, we ended up with a single piece back glass and one less grandpa-esque thing on the truck. Now, right now, it still feels a little bit like a greenhouse or a fishbowl with this huge surface of open glass where you can see the interior. Later on, when we add a little bit of tint, that's going to change and it's going to add to the ambiance of the truck entirely, especially when we add our headache rack with our light bar and everything to access the bed and make everything a little bit safer. That'll all come later. The main thing is we have a brand new piece of glass with a brand new seal, and with the help of Kate, I was able to get it in and all installed. Now we can move on to finally putting in the headliner that we've been working on since this morning. Hopefully that goes a little bit easier than this project did. there it is. It's the last of the trim. So let's take a look at what we got done. Well, that was a huge pain in the ass. It's not perfect, but I do like it. And you notice our A-pillar looks great. Our front windshield trim looks really good. Now remember, this truck didn't have any of that. All the way up. Now this is Suburban trim up to here. Our B-pillar looks good. And if I can fold the seat down, you'll know it goes all the way to the floor and it looks great. And across the back window and in the back is where things get interesting. So the end of our Suburban trim is there, and then I think I have a single cab rear C-pillar trim. You'll notice there's about a 1-inch gap up there. And I'll deal with that later. I have to make some type of cover for that. I think the problem is that's a single cab rear cab corner. I don't know. But it needs to cover that up, and it doesn't. I don't feel like buying another one, so it's easier to make it cover than to buy another one. And then whatever we have going on across the back window, I'm not really sure. I don't know what trim that was originally. I think it's right. Could be right. I don't know. But it does actually cover everything, and it looks pretty good. Main thing is, now we have a single piece back glass, which I've been looking forward to since I got the truck. So I'm pretty stoked about that. Got a lot done so far. Now I don't know if I mentioned it previously, but I did get the sub box I was waiting on for the back. Now I can allocate the spacing for the rear seat. Knowing where that is, I threw some brackets down there to hold it in place, and that should do just fine. But now I can allocate the rear seat space, and moving on to the front, I had originally stuck this straight to the floor pan, which is fine for moving it in and out of the garage, but frankly it's way too low. With this cowl hood and the very long overhang of the front end, it makes it impossible to see what you're doing. And while backing up, you can see almost nothing because you're actually below the window line. So we got to raise this front seat and get the rear seat mounted permanently. That way we know what we're actually dealing with, so eventually I can send these seats off to be reupholstered. So I think the seats are the next priority. I made up some spacers that are just over 2 inches long that I think are going to be the appropriate height. So I'm going to drill our holes, got to mark out the rear holes, and I'm going to install these spacers through the floor pan, and hopefully that'll give us adequate height. If it's too tall, I can bust these loose and I can drop it down just shy of 1 inch. But we'll see what works out best. I think 2 inches is about the magic number here that'll get us up to the eye line that I'm looking for. We ended up spacing the front seat about 2 1/4 inch. Now I believe this seat, let me see there. So these are 1/2 inch grade 8 bolts. I believe this seat is out of a late 90s, early 2000s Ranger, but it works fine for where it's at. And I'm actually really happy with how it sits now. The eye line is so much better, and it opened up some space underneath the front seat if I want to put some storage underneath. So I'm happy with that, and it really made it so I can actually see over the hood and see out the back window. Now, for the rear seat, I'm actually using what would have been the original front seat from this truck, and we're going to end up putting it back here. So based on the fact that the floor pans are the same front and rear, I think it's going to end up being a very similar spacing. But now that I have the sub box in place, I can get my space allocated, and I can actually try and get things mounted up into place. But I don't think I'm going to do that today. I'm going to go ahead and end the video right there on account of we're going into Thanksgiving this week, and there's a lot of stuff to do, so I'm not really going to be able to do any video this week, naturally. But I'm probably going to work on getting the rear seat mounted, and by the time we start the next video, I'm probably going to be working on the carpet and sound deadening for the floor, and all of the sill panels and kick panels and all that stuff, and ultimately transitioning into putting in the dash and all the gauges. Really excited about all that stuff because a lot of that stuff I already have, or at least I'm coming up with a solid plan for what I want to do. But most importantly, I feel good about what I got done this week, and I have a lot more that I can do while I'm waiting for more parts and before I start shifting gears into another project or whatever else comes next. Most importantly, have a safe holiday. I'm going to try and get some stuff done, and we hope to see you guys real soon on the next one. So, for now, wackadoo out.